Because, simply put, I put it in the stream title, this season is very weird for Top 50. The thing about this season that's very different from every other RCS season is that it is very much so a hybrid RCS season. We had 3 online events in the form of Riptide, Heatwave 4, and Genesis 8. So those were our 3 online or offline events. And then we had 4 online events as well. And that's already very different from most seasons. For one, it's hardly any events whatsoever. So there's only 7 events that actually qualify for Top 50, which is pretty different compared to like seasons like Season 4, where we had like a dozen metric fuck ton of local events that we used, because we had the RCS events and then we also had the Grassroots League events. Obviously, COVID messed shit up. You know, no other way to put it, COVID messed shit up. We had the online season, which was also weird. I'd argue this one's a little weirder, though, because as far as the ranking goes for this season, I can go ahead and switch over to the article. As you guys can see, this year we brought back the panel system from blah 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 blah, but with a bit of a twist to accommodate the hybrid season. Players were ranked based on their 3 eligible events, including consideration for their wins and losses to land them at their results. So already, this is the biggest difference about this season. It was the one thing that everyone was talking about when this season was announced. Because you have the three best events, and what that means is that as long as you do good in 3 events, the others aren't really going to impact you. And as some players immediately found out, that was pretty abusable. But we'll get into that a little bit. The reason why we went with that is because in previous seasons, there was a similar thing in place where, let's say you have someone that just entered literally every event under the sun. Back when there was like over a dozen events, that meant that if you had one bad event, but all the others were still pretty solid, it wouldn't really bring you down that much. But in a smaller season like this where there aren't as many events, that's kind of why the 3 best events came into place, you know? There's also the fact that online, you know, at least at the start of the season, did not have rollback yet. So it was notably different from local events, and for some people that's kind of a turnoff. Because of that, they still wanted to encourage players to enter, and you know, even if they do end up doing worse online, as long as they do good locally, it won't really matter that much for them. And that kinda brought in some weird discrepancies this season. There were definitely some players that sandbagged during the online events, because they knew that they had good placements locally, and that would just carry them. As far as the top 50 rank goes, there's really only one player where we had to make, like, a hard exception for, and that was Cake. Because Cake got first place at every single local event. Obviously, kind of ridiculous. Online events, he sandbagged. It was not Cake trying his hardest during the online events. He got 7th in one of them after lagging out literally everyone in losers before eventually getting DQ'd. And then the other events he entered, he just threw. There's a bit of an obvious difference there between a Cake Assault that is literally winning everything and a Cake Assault that is literally not even close to winning everything. That was the only, like, real exception we made. As far as it came to the ranking and such, that was the only real exception we made, where we looked at it like, okay, Cake is obviously, like, the best player. Spoiler alert, if you couldn't figure that out by winning literally every single local event. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, Cake is obviously the best player, but online Cake is not the same player. So we're kind of looking at this as like, okay, online Cake is still a good player, they're still a notable win, but they're not a win on the #1 player in the world. That's kind of how we looked at it for Cake, and Cake was pretty much the only exception we made as far as like the sandbagging and stuff goes. But aside from that, we really didn't even like need to worry too much about online performances, because for the most part, people didn't really, like, place that much differently compared to how they normally did. Like, I went Maple in one of the online events. I was planning to sandbag. And then I ended up getting 9th anyway, so it was like, oh, okay. Well, that worked, I guess. For most people, it wasn't that different. The other thing about this 3 best event format that makes it a bit different from other seasons is that in this season, consistency is seriously important. Because the thing about just being able to straight up delete your worst events, that means that if you're getting rid of your worst events and you still have some bad events on there, it's gonna stick out a little more. So consistency definitely mattered a lot more this season compared to others. And that's something that you'll definitely notice when it comes to ranking furthers, is that you might have players that have one really, really strong event that obviously places them above people. But when it comes to comparing against similar opponents, it might be more valuable to have multiple good events rather than just one outstanding one. Obviously, when it comes to reviewing the list, we'll go over that. I'll be sure to bring that up because there's going to be a lot of cases of it. But it's just something to keep in mind. Aside from that, that's like the main part of what makes things like different for this season. So just as like a general like reminder of how, as a panel, we tend to look at it and how we tend to value data, there are like 4 things I'd say that really, really matter when it comes to looking at data and whatnot. By far, the most important data when it comes to ranking top 50 is the wins. First of all, if you're picking up a lot of good wins, that will like help your placement. Your placement will reflect that. If you got good wins, chances are you also got a good placement. And in that case, placements kind of tend to go hand in hand with wins. Where if someone got a good placement, chances are they'd have good wins. You might have lucky brackets for sure. And in that case, that might affect the player a little worse when it comes to rankings. Because if they didn't beat that many good players, but they still ended up getting far in bracket, then that means that they didn't pick up any good wins along the way. And they didn't really have to like fight anyone that was that scary along the way. As opposed to someone that picks up a top 20, top 10, top 5 win along the way. That's obviously a lot more impressive. So wins definitely matter the most. I will say, this season, like tying back to the consistency thing, losses are a lot more important this season too. Losses are kind of weird when it comes to the top 50 rankings, because the thing about it is that these are tournaments that have so many people in them that it's kind of hard to like immediately pick out what's a bad loss. You might be able to obviously point out, like, okay, this person lost to someone that's obviously going to be ranked below them. That's notable. But it might not be that bad to the point where it, like, really killed their placement or really hurts their repertoire overall. Because they might have a bad loss but still pick up some good wins along the way, and that'll be, like, good for them. Basically, losses, they matter more this season because, again, consistency is really important, but the main thing to look at with losses is how it, like, affected their placement. I think a good example of this, and I'm actually gonna go ahead and hop over to our spreadsheet here. Let's show this example off. Where are you? Hoppinets. So, Hoppinets' performance at Genesis. They got 9th at Genesis, and in winners, they lost to Whack. Whack is not ranked this season, so this is obviously a pretty bad loss, especially for a player of Hoppy's caliber, but they still beat Derai, they beat SBS, they beat Y, they got good wins along the way to 9th, which is a good placement. So, for a player like Hoppinets, this wouldn't really necessarily be as bad. You know, obviously the loss sticks out. It's really bad for them. And it might affect rankings when it comes to, like, ranking players that are close to Hoppy. But it's still not going to be as bad for them in the end. If you want to look at something that's, like, pretty inexcusably bad, we got Rift here. Now, Rift has a pretty solid repertoire. Their RCS Fireworks is especially notable. Wins on Crusader and Bagel is kind of amazing. But then you look at their 65th at Hot Springs, losing to John Jake, who has never been ranked. This is obviously a good bit worse, because not only do you have the bad loss here, you also have a pretty bad placement that was obviously affected by the bad loss. So in a case like this is where it's a bit more obvious, saying, yeah, okay, this is not a good loss for this season. John Jake's pretty slow. No, I'm not throwing shade. I'm looking at this from a pure, like, data standpoint. This is a player that has never been ranked. If you want a similar story, we can look at, what MSB was actually just talking about. Where is he? There we go. Yegi. So Yegi also has a 65th at Hot Springs, but unlike Rift, their 65th is losing to Uda and Bagel, which is some seriously cursed bracket luck that might have had a slight bit of sandbagging involved. This still affects Yegi, for sure, because the reality of it is, you lost to a Bagel and losers that lost to a bad opponent that bracket. I say bad in quotation marks, again, no shade, but statistically bad for Bagels to lose to. It still affects Yegi, but it's not going to be, like, explicitly as bad compared to, like, how it is for Rift. Where, again, this one's all you, buddy. That one's all you. There's no bracket luck involved in that. That's a pretty good example of how losses can and can't affect things. And that's also a good example of how placements can and can't affect things. By far, the biggest part will always be wins, and it's sort of just like how the losses contradict that, and how the placements contradict that. And if there's contradictions, they might end up going lower, but otherwise, they're going to be higher up on the list compared to just getting good wins. Placements definitely start to matter more once you get to the upper echelon of things. Like, once you start getting to the top 15, top 10, top 5, that's when placements start mattering more and more and more. And having, like, for example, a first place on your resume is definitely extremely valuable when you're talking about top 5 stuff. It's all up to discretion, and again, I'll make sure to go over all of this once the list gets revealed more and more, and we get to have more examples to show off, basically. Yo, Editing Sparks here. I totally realized I forgot to mention the fourth data thing that matters, which is head-to-head. Now, the thing about head-to-head is that realistically, it matters the least out of anything. What head-to-head is really, really helpful for is figuring out tiebreakers. So if there's two people that are just ridiculously close to each other, but one person has a set win on the other, that can help tip them over. That's pretty much the only thing that head-for-head is useful for, though, and in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't come up that often. So that's sort of how you can, like, look at data and how we tend to look at data. But if you guys want to look at the data for yourselves, again, I showed it off here. This is a spreadsheet that I threw together, and there is a ton of players in here with all of their results. You know, you can scroll down here, you can pick up results for the people that are going to make the list, and even a few people that are just shy of the list. And kind of just bring up their results, see how they did, kind of get the data for yourself, and make your own informed opinion. On top of that, I also have this spreadsheet right here. Now this is a spreadsheet that Menace made. It is a tennis ranking, and what this does is it purely calculates points based off of placements. Now the thing about this ranking is that it doesn't calculate wins whatsoever. There's no like ELO or anything involved in that. It is purely based off of placements. Typically, when we're doing the top 50 ranking, we use this as a baseline to essentially get a vague idea of how valuable wins are, because we can kind of look at it, it's like, okay, how valuable is a Cursed Crusader win this season? Okay, the Menace ranking says he's right here. So we're going to start that at where we're going to put that right there and say this is how valuable it is as of right now when we're making the first draft for our list. Then, once the list is completed, we look it all over again just to make sure, like, say, okay, was the Menace doc wrong in any places? Because some players may move up a lot where they didn't have quite as good placements, but they still got really good wins. Or players might move down where they got good placements, but they didn't quite have good wins. The other thing about this list that's kind of weird is that the online multiplier, in previous seasons, online is weighed way less than it was this season. This season, since there's only 7 events and half of them are online, the online events matter a lot more. I guess that's one thing I forgot to mention, too. One thing that this season did, and I'm gonna scroll to where it mentions this. Yeah, it says the weight of the events are as follows. So we've got Genesis 8, followed by Heatwave, followed by Riptide. So you have the 3 local events that are the highest weighted, and the reason why it's like this is honestly it pretty naturally happens based on who's attending. Because what you guys have to realize, the local events had Cake Assault, whereas the online events had online Cake Assault, which, again, we mentioned before, online Cake Sandbags, that's like a top 20 player. It's not number 1. Because Cake is like not the same player online, that already lowers the value of those events pretty naturally. And so that's why these events are like pretty naturally under the big local events, because they're less top heavy. They don't have the best player ever. Similarly, Melody is ranked the lowest out of all the online events because Melody did not have Penguin, nor did it have Soul Rifle, if I'm not mistaken. Because of that, like, top heaviness matters a lot for these events, but then when it comes to ordering the other ones, like, Genesis is at the top because it's the finals. It's pretty self-explanatory there. Genesis always has more weight than the other events. Heatwave and Riptide were really close, but Heatwave had a little more meat on its bones when it came to, like, the general, like, density of top 50 players, whereas Riptide was a slightly more top-heavy, but not by much. So we opted for Heatwave. They're very close. And then Crystal is definitely the most stacked online event. Just had a bunch of players show up for that one. And then RCS, Fireworks, and Hot Springs were about the same. Fireworks a little better. But all of these events, like, realistically are not that far off from each other. I think I have a good example for this. So if we want to talk about comparing different events, like when it comes to player runs, you actually have two pretty similar runs here. We have BioBurbs, which I'm still not used to that name, by the way. We have Bio's run at Heatwave here, where they place third. You know, you beat Zaro, you beat Penguin, you beat Darai, you beat Akashi. Really solid wins. Really solid placement. I'd argue that a placement like this, and with these wins, is extremely similar to something like LP's second at Melody, where they, again, beat Kusi, Zaro, Cheesy, Kodak. Again, solid wins. Realistically, even though, like, if you look at it numerically, obviously second is better than third, but because of how naturally stacked the events are, the runs kind of end up being the same. And that's kind of how we look at it at top 50. It's not necessarily like saying, oh, because you got these wins at Melody, you're going to be placed lower than someone who got their wins somewhere else. That's not necessarily how it works. There's a lot more to it than that. Where I think the weight matters the most is when it comes to, again, something that's very unique to this season, which is picking your 3 best events. Because it's pretty obvious to look at it for LP here, like, okay, Crystal matters more than Fireworks, so we'll pick Crystal for LP's third event. I think I have another idea of someone who's a good example for this. Giga Bowser had a very funny season. Literally only placed 17th at every single event he entered, to the point where I even made fun of him in the extra section. So when it came to picking Giga's 3 best events, it's like, oh god, alright, which 3 17ths do we choose here? We ended up going with, once again, the 3 most stacked events. So it was Heatwave and Riptide, and you didn't enter Genesis, so the next best thing is Crystal. There you go. There's your 3. Obviously, it won't always pan out like this. If you have an incredible run on one of the less stacked events, like maybe you had a really good Melody, that's obviously going to be chosen. That's kind of just how it is. And again, on this spreadsheet, I've highlighted the events on the side that were chosen for the 3 best events. So that is something that you can use for yourselves when it comes to gathering data. When it comes to comparing players to each other, again, we compare the 3 best events, so essentially this Melody and this Hot Springs are off their record. Nothing they did here really matters when it comes to ranking them, which definitely helps some players, like, sorry to single you out here, Reina, but your 33rd at Riptide is off the record. This event does not exist, because you have 3 much better ones here. Again, that's how it is, and again, if you want all of this data for yourselves, you can use !top 50. When it comes to the YouTube highlight that I need to make, I'll probably throw it in the description or something, so look down there if you're watching on YouTube. Hi, YouTube. This isn't the weirdest season because Season 1 and Season 2 existed. True. Yeah, back when everything was just, like, decided by George opinion, and you could make top 50 based on, player influence, or whatever. Dan and George ranking based on vibes. The number 49, like, just being a meme. Dude, the U was so funny. Mango at 49 was, like, almost convincing, but then they just, like, turned it into a complete meme for Season 2. And it was funny.